it's interesting to see that tension, dynamic take place. And I think it's fair to say, when we need to be speeding up, we're not going quick enough. And all of a sudden at the last minute, when we have these massive global initiatives to move from commitments to actual implementation, we see other countries slowing things down. That's frustrating. And that's really, really hard to see.
Welcome to The Greener Way. I'm your host, Michelle Baltazar, Executive Director of Media at FS Sustainability. We are recording on Gadigal land and we pay our respects to the traditional custodians of country and the elders past and present. Last month, the world's largest and most important climate conference was held in Brazil. Called the COP30 because it is the 30th annual gathering of the UN Conference of the Parties, this year's program marks 10 years since the Paris Agreement. So what were the key takeaways from the event? To talk about this, we are joined by climate change expert who attended COP30 himself, Dr. Evan Senta, Senior Manager, Environment and Climate Change from the UN Global Compact Network Australia. Evan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Michelle.
Now, for those who have just joined the sustainability industry, can you tell us about the UN Global Compact?
Yeah, the Global Compact, we're the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative. We have about 20,000 plus businesses worldwide that we work with. And in Australia, domestically, we work across 400 businesses, maybe a little bit less than that, and the majority of the ASX 20. And we do a lot of work with that bigger end of town. What we do is support businesses on driving sustainable development goals, or SDGs, and our 10 principles of essentially ethical business in terms of environment, human rights, and governance practices. And what it looks like when we work with those businesses is, helping our sustainability professionals, as well as board directors, CEOs, CSOs, even CFOs, as they seek to really do corporate responsible things like eradicate modern slavery and work through mandatory climate disclosure requirements and support good board governance, avoiding greenwashing and more. So we really look to bring business together, help them drive business practices that are really good, and work through some of those issues that are tricky for business.
Yes, so this is really important for us at FS Sustainability, where a lot of our listeners either work in a listed company or they work in a super fund that are highly invested in the health of listed companies. But going back to COP30, there's been a lot of news articles about, oh my goodness, how disappointing it was. We didn't do what we promised we're going to do. There are so many challenges, and now we've got COP31 to talk about. But from an insider's point of view, can you contextualize the conversation happening in the mainstream, but what is COP really about?
Yeah. I found that Berlin was wild. Like, COP was quite a bit there. I've heard the phrase, every COP is different, and this was no exception. But placing COP in the middle of the Amazon rainforest, I think you really have some big expectations. And a couple of those were, our exit roadmap outside of fossil fuels. We also have a global exit away from deforestation. And those were big ticket negotiating items. And, we didn't see the actual implementation that we wanted to see on those negotiation items. And I think that's a really fair criticism. This was supposed to be the COP of truth. Often it was called the COP of implementation or the COP of action, where we start, looking at the commitments we're making and just figure out how we're going to do them. And that figuring out process takes a while because everyone has representation at COP, right? And so, our Pacific Island brothers and sisters that are incredibly affected by climate change, get a voice alongside some of the richer companies that have more energy, or countries that have more energy security. When we see on the ground those negotiations happen, I think you realize what a consensus building process looks like, what it looks like when you have all the voices in the room. And then it's not easy to just shift from one thing to another, even if that's what we'd really like that outcome to be. It was interesting in Belém being on the ground there, and you'd feel the excitement of some of the negotiations taking place, or some of the pavilion items, or the big ticket speakers. Just a few feet away, you have Queen Mary of Denmark speaking, and then another keynote speech by Al Gore, and everyone's kind of on an even playing field. And there's a lot of excitement, especially in the Australian pavilion, about what's going on. And then you kind of wake up and see kind of some of the news reports coming out of COP. And it was very, very different than being on the ground, right? On the ground, you get the sense of engagement and progress and action. And that's very much happening. The reports are often about what's not happening, which is we're not progressing fast enough. And I agree with that. But it's really good to see the hard work we're doing start to pay off as well. And that's something that you very much felt a part of in that COP community.
Now, this is on the lighter side of the equation, but I heard that at least the coffee was good, so it encouraged conversations on the ground. But certainly, it would have been a surprise to see all the criticism in the media about what didn't happen. But let's say, for example, there's a lot of conversation about the rich countries, the poor countries, countries with food security, and those who don't. And you've just rightly pointed out, well, here, Michelle, everyone gets a seat at the table. Can you walk me through? So, who's attending which sessions? And, any anecdotes you can share about people genuinely want to create some kind of new momentum around climate change and the problems we have?
Yeah, I think there are a couple different times. A quick anecdote. I was standing, getting ready to exit one day when I see all of the security, all of the high level security just rushing towards the exit, just with this, wild look in their eyes, just like stop what's going on. Everyone move out of the way. I saw, police yelling at people for filming. We're like, whoa, there must be a really high level delegate that's leaving or something. And that wasn't the case. Those were the protests that were happening with the indigenous voices coming out that were not in COP, even though there was strong representation, the strongest ever at COP. And
Hmm.
with the protest, I woke up the next morning and I saw, this narrative that, protesters were unhappy with COP. But I would say almost everyone in that building or, that massive hangar, you've got tens of thousands of people were very much on the same side of what the protesters want. They had an amazing outcome with the Brazilian government looking to protect more First Nations and indigenous territories within the Amazon. Those really good to see kind of those things happen. When you get to COP, we often forget the logistics of it. It's a massive, massive conference. And that's what it is at the end of the day. Your star of the show is your negotiations. That's often what's reported on. And then you have this other area, the Blue Zone, which houses the negotiations. And it's kind of the conference within the conference. And the Blue Zone has different, spaces in it that are called pavilions. And those pavilions host networking events. They host panels. They, host discussions and people and keynotes. And so you very much have a conference going on outside of the negotiations. And then there's the green zone. That's open for everyone. You don't need special access to get in. You don't need to be a delegate or a part of negotiations to get into the event. But the green zone is more an extension of the blue zone, and also, where you see a lot of your trade exhibition and different things going on within the green zone. All of that comes together in one place to kind of create different reports and narratives that we get. But a lot of those protests, were very much joined a few days later, bringing it back to those, indigenous protests at the beginning where you saw 40,000 plus people marching the streets of Belém, in support. And these were the people that attended COP, right? And so there's a very communal atmosphere, even though there's a lot going on. And I think that's sometimes the nuance of that is a little bit tricky to pick up when you're not there.
Oh, that would have been such an emotional moment for the First Nations and Indigenous leaders to see this support from this global conference. Now, you talked about so many things happen, but what would be the key takeaways for the sustainability professionals based here in Australia? What are the key highlights, if you like, from COP30?
So I think for business, we have nature, compliance, and risk management. Nature really, shined at COP, right? It was incredible to see the pavilions, the discussions really take place and talk about the impact of nature on our global decarbonization efforts. When we look at things like sitting in the actual Amazon and focusing on how globally we're going to move away from deforestation and what that means for business, you see a lot of conversations happening around nature that will have big impacts on agriculture, fast moving consumer goods, and a number of different sectors that have massive nature risk within their supply chains. In terms of compliance and risk management, our NDCs or nationally determined contributions, Australia put theirs out just a couple months ago, and that's going to have an effect in relationship to our mandatory climate related disclosure practices that are new in Australia, and I think really have a chance to lead the world. That old saying, what's measured gets managed. We'll see that very
Right.
much playing out on a global stage as we start to disclose our efforts in the climate, on climate-related financial disclosure. And we'll see those levers get pulled for businesses that are doing more to support their compliance efforts through good due diligence practices, good reporting. And then from risk management, there's a lot of focus now on adaptation. The two discussions that often happen at COP are around mitigation. How do we, prevent more climate warming, global warming from happening? And the adaptation, what do we do amidst that global warming, right? So in terms of business risk, we committed in the negotiations to 3 times the amount of finance for adaptation measures over the next 10 years. There's going to be a lot of businesses in real estate, insurance, manufacturing, construction that are really planning for resilience and adaptation in a new climate and a new economy that we're shifting around that's going to have more energy security for different countries. So we're really focused around nature compliance, risk management. Those are the things that I'd really focus on from business and taking a look at what's happening at COP30 this year.
I'm really disappointed. I believed in the Hollywood ending that would be able to truly keep a lead on global warming. But here we are talking about the new norm. So my final question, I guess, is to talk about what were the setbacks, what were the valid criticisms, and do you see those same issues raised for the next COP or in the next conference?
Yeah, so COP31 will be a tricky place. I think the criticisms are quite valid. Right at the last moment of the negotiations, right, we very much looked like the Brazilian presidency, which was handling the negotiations, would have a bit of an actual roadmap out of fossil fuels and out of deforestation globally. And then there's a last second meeting. All of a sudden, the language and everything got watered down very quickly. And then it got pushed through, but with a lot less impact. And then we saw some countries calling out other countries really disrespectfully because they wanted that language watered down, right? And they wanted those changes in there. And so it's interesting to see that tension, that dynamic take place. And I think it's fair to say, when we need to be speeding up, we're not going quick enough. And all of a sudden at the last minute, when we have these massive global initiatives to move from commitments to actual implementation, we see other countries slowing things down. That's frustrating. And that's really, really hard to see. Next year, I think, though, there's a bit of an opportunity for the Australian government as we, handle those negotiations in Turkey, right? We have an opportunity there to really make sure this roadmap, where the conversations finally got started on implementation, actually see progress. And because we're handling those negotiations, we have an incredible team at DQ led by Sally Box. And Dr. Box's team really punches above their weight. I really believe that they're going to have this really cool opportunity to carry on this conversation throughout the year and then make an exit away from fossil fuels, which Australia has now joined in support, possibly happen, right? And an actual roadmap where we can actually do it. And that would be the important thing, right? We need to get to the doing and stop talking about commitments. And I think that's what everyone on this team really wants.
You and me both. And Australia does have a track record of following through with roadmaps and strategies and vision. So in financial services, superannuation was one of the hotly contested debate a few decades ago, but now we know that the value of it in retirement. So let's hope that next year, definitely Australia plays a bigger role and cement all these big questions we have about how are we going to solve these challenges in front of us. Evan, I know there's so much more to unpack, but thank you so much for sharing your personal experience. How was it being at the Amazon rainforest?
Oh man, it was incredible. It was hot. I think the temperature was a great equalizer for the entire venue. But, the people in Belém and the Amazon rainforest extended beyond there were just such incredible hosts. The Australian Pavilion was just absolutely incredible at serving good coffee and taking care of everyone. Just a fantastic experience.
That's great to hear. Evan, once again, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Michelle.
This is The Greener Way. I'm Michelle Baltazar. Thank you for listening.
The Greener Way podcast is a product of FS Sustainability. All information in this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. It is not intended as a substitute for professional, legal, or tax advice. Before making any financial decisions, you should read the product disclosure statement, and if necessary, consult a licensed financial professional. For more information, head to the disclaimer page on the FS Sustainability website, fssustainability.com.au.